Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Louie Vargas, and I'm the founder of NFCP. And we're here with a special guest, James Newport from the Swift Center. We've touched base offline, and they're doing really great work over there. And I thought it would just be a super interesting topic to bring to our community, because I don't think that, at least for me, I never thought about forecasting in this way that could help our community. So before we kick into that, I just want to remind everybody that this is for informational purposes only. This is not legal advice. So if you have any specific questions to a customer or anything related to your specific institution, please raise that internally. Also, if you want to know more about NFCP, please reach out to us on our website, which is nfcp.info, or via our LinkedIn page, or reach out to me directly. We have also a lot of collaborators, but yeah, happy to facilitate that information across if necessary. And yeah, I mean, those are the quick kind of housekeeping rules that I have. But without further ado, I want to give the word to James. Give us an introduction to who you are and kind of what Swift Center is all about.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. First of all, it's great work you're doing in the network. Yes, so I'm James Newport. I'm acting executive director of the Swift Center for Applied Forecasting. And we often drop those last few words off, but it's kind of a crucial element of the organization, which I'll go into later. But my background is I spent 5 years in HM Treasury in the UK, the UK's Economic and Financial Ministry, on the International Financial Directorate, mainly on international development. I was also part of the initial Ukraine response team for the Treasury, dealing with humanitarian and financial assistance from the Treasury, and also obviously linking up very closely at the time to what were the sanctions and illicit finance regime, which was kind of in response to the war. So it's really fascinating to come back to a group like this, talk about financial crime and what I'm doing now on forecasting. And the kind of transition for me towards forecasting and towards the Swift Center was at the end of my time in Treasury. I studied a master's in cognitive and decision sciences, really just focusing on how can we make better decisions in the policy and strategy space. Obviously, there's lots of decision-making problems in government to do with hierarchical and politics, etc. But also just on a fundamental level, how do we make decisions? How do we try and predict what's going to happen in a policy or what's going to happen in the world? And through that master's, I did a lot of work on forecasting, a lot of work around Bayesian reasoning and how you can improve. And kind of at the end of that, as I left Treasury and did some consulting work, I ended up working with the Swift Center, who, as I say, is a Swift Center for Applied Forecasting. They take the scientific literature on forecasting and the research that backs that and use it to deploy in applied contexts. So whether that's towards regulatory change, geopolitical events which will impact different industries, it's all about, well, how can we actually use forecasting? How can we use this kind of scientifically rigorous process around trying to predict the future to actually help people who are making decisions now about what they should or shouldn't do? So that's kind of us, myself, and Swift Center in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that at least for me, it's super interesting to hear how you made your way to this kind of career, because at least for me, a lot of the people I see or hear that go to this are, in the sciences or in math, but you came from a different background, and very much, like you said, similar to our community comes from. Well, now to see that you kind of coming in from a different angle, but understand our concerns and the issues that we face, I think I would hope would drive kind of this mentality that we could use these technologies and think of things in a different way in order to be more proactive instead of just reactive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where the kind of interest from me came, as I was dealing with real world decisions of taking up a Ukraine context and we're responding to that. Okay, if we do, the team are thinking through X sanction, or if we do this financial response, what does that mean? What's the trajectory of the war going to be? What have we got to think about in terms of our actions? And it was really about well, how can we make the best decisions and judgments here so that we can react accordingly? And that's kind of where my interest grew. So yeah, I agree. It's unusual, but it's nice, and hopefully it's complementary to what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. And so, yeah, I know you you created a presentation for us. So yeah, can you just walk us through in a bit more detail of the work that you're doing at the Swift Center and how forecasting works, especially in the context of financial crime and compliance?
Absolutely. Yes, I will share, and cool, that seems to have worked. Perfect. Yes, absolutely. I've got a few slides here to kind of rush through and give a bit of context, and hopefully don't disturb my face for too long. get nice graphics. But yeah, kind of three things to cover. What is forecasting? Give people everyone a bit of a background of like where we're actually coming from. What is it? What good versus great actually looks like, and why that is a benefit and why that matters. And then kind of finishing up, as you say, talking about what's the application for actual financial crime prevention, and looking at a case study, which you said would be particularly interesting. One thing to focus on forecasting is it's ultimately just a practice of making informed predictions about the future. It's kind of as it says on the tin, it's the kind of self-explanatory. And for strategy, innovation, risk management, it helps answer questions such as, ones I've got on the screen here about will a cyber attack happen, probability of a geopolitical conflict. Those are quite topic, kind of consistent ones that people will often see. You can go deeper into like, will there be a regulatory change? Will there be border conflicts? These are all kind of bread and butter for what forecasts are. And forecasts are probabilistic, which often leads it into the realm where people say, oh, it's just finger in the air, you're just guessing. You're just sticking a number on something which can't be known, and it's kind of meaningless. And how I'd counter that will be two things in my next slide, but one here as well is the approach we take with professional forecasting and research is not to purely guessing. It uses data, it uses evidence, and it uses structural reasoning, which is kind of a key component to bring it all together to form the most accurate prediction you can get with today's state of the art. So it's definitely more robust than just having people in a room who give kind of intuitive thoughts and hope for best. But kind of to counter the main point of that, or to like really emphasize why kind of that question in itself almost to me doesn't always make a lot of sense, because ultimately in an uncertain world, we're always making predictions. And I could point to a really crude example, which we do every day, which is crossing the street. As you can see here, people trying to, what seems to be copy what the Beatles were doing, but they're making a prediction that they're going to cross the street and that bus is not going to just continue and plow into them, or its brakes aren't going to fail. And obviously we do constant little predictions like this every day. We'll be like, we're going to make this, we're going to cross the road, we're going to buy this food, it's not going to poison us, etc. These are ultimately predictions. It's not certain that's not going to happen, but it's highly confident, highly certain, highly kind of likely that's all going to be fine. And then you kind of move down from the kind of everyday scenarios like that towards more complicated ones from, do I accept this job or not? And you start asking yourself, well, should I accept it? And actually what you're asking yourselves is questions under that, which is, am I going to be happier taking this job? Is it going to advance my career, etc.? And there's all predictions again. There's no certainty there. Are you going to like your team more? You don't know. You're making ultimately a prediction. And then finally, you get to like really complex and difficult problems, like stuff you deal with in sanctions. What is a sanction? How is a sanction going to play out in the real world? Is a government even going to take a sanction in the first place? And if they do, what are the downstream effects? What does this mean for wider geopolitical conflict and risk of other sanctions and elsewhere? If you sanction Russia, are they going to set up a bunch of shell companies in X region? These are really complex problems that you have to deal with. And where I would say, when you're crossing the street, you probably don't need to consult someone like us about whether you need that forecasted. You're probably all right. When you get to these kind of highly uncertain scenarios, such as sanctions, that's a more prime kind of example of actually putting some structure around this is going to give you massive accuracy benefits. So, and then you have to almost kind of accept from that most of the time people are generally quite bad at making predictions and forecasts. And this is one of the things that's been like a landmark research. If anyone's seen this stuff previously on forecasts, you would have seen Philip Tetlock. I think somewhat misquoted, but effectively the quote is that experts are like dart throwing chimps. Like they're not very good at getting things accurate. You might as well just flip a coin. It's not great. And we see this in the real world. We saw this last week. If any of you in the UK, you would see that there's turmoil in the government as the Deputy Prime Minister. Will she or will she not lose her job? And you've got someone like Ed Balls, previous Shadow Chancellor, and George Osborne, who was the Chancellor, apparently both predicting that she will likely survive it. Keyword being likely there. For certain. They were saying she's likely going to stay. So if you read that, you'd be like, okay, this is kind of what experts in the field think. And of course, she has gone. That's one example. If you want to go into more technical areas, the graph on the right shows how within just a space of a year, experts who were asked about AI capabilities, how it shifted. And you can see some quite substantial shifts there. 100 years change from a full automation of labor from after 2150 to now just after 2100. I mean, there's also arguments to say that so far out, it's completely meaningless to forecast that, but you can just see, like, if you're relying in 2022 on a bunch of these forecasts, including ones about will it be able to code, and they're saying it won't be able to code until write Python script until 2027, well, it can definitely write that now. If you're making a big business bet in 2023, you might be quite frustrated that these forecasts are wrong. So, you have this kind of countering thing where people say, oh, it's always wrong. I'd actually say the stuff on the right is quite good. It shows people are updating and how things are changing, and actually that's quite good practice, but it kind of all feeds into the narrative of like, well, no one knows, it's all so uncertain, you can just, might as well guess. And this was a problem which the kind of birth of forecasting research really started was in 2012, when the US intelligence agency launched a forecasting tournament off the back of a number of kind of intelligence kind of gaps, so we say, where things like 9/11, things like WMDs in Iraq. And the fallout was, well, we need to be better at trying to predict what's going to happen. We need to forecast the best method. So they did an open competition, and at that time, the state of the art was literally just take a bunch of experts' views, combine it as an aggregate, and you take the median, which is what the kind of beans graphic is there representing. Because if any of you know, you can cheat in those kind of counter beam game by looking at everyone else's estimates, and generally the median is pretty much the right answer. So they launched this competition. It was open to multiple different research teams. People built models. They even had an internal intelligence team, which were kind of competing against them. And the idea was simple: how do we get the most accurate forecast? And what they found was the leading project, which was a Good Judgment Project, and Swift Center's actually managing director Michael Story was a leading member of that, one of the original forecasters as part of it. Was that they found that a small percentage of people, roughly around 2%. Sometimes a little bit less, can predict the future with 60% greater degree of accuracy than the average person. And that's obviously a huge difference. And what that kind of looks like, to kind of illustrate it, is I've got two graphs here which are called calibration plots. And ultimately, all they're plotting is if someone says it's going to happen 40% of the time, do events that they say will happen 40% of the time happen 4 out of 10 times or 40% of the time. So it's basically saying how much can you rely on someone who says, look, I think it's 90% likely. In 9 out of 10 scenarios, they should be right. If their dots are perfectly within that grey band, then they are perfectly calibrated. They are almost like that octopus which can guess the World Cup games, like spot on. And the one on the left is obviously more messy. What we ultimately have is someone who's the median. In a forecasting, there's a various different forecasting platforms. The left one is a person who's uses median calibration plots, kind of the average person you'd see, kind of quite unreliable dots. When they say it's going to happen 50% of the time, it kind of happens 35% of the time, so you can't really bank on that. On the right is one of the professional forecasters, may or may not be a Swift Center forecaster, but as you see, the line is much closer. You've got much higher reliability to know, okay, when they say this, they're getting quite close to the truth. And the other interesting part of this is that the professional forecasters can outperform they outperformed intelligent analysts. So people with kind of secret information which was hidden from them, they were able to outperform them in terms of accuracy across hundreds, I believe almost over 1,000 questions. So huge sample size. We're not talking like 10 questions they get right. These are hundreds and hundreds of questions which were tested over multiple years. And the study was so successful that it was a 4-year study, which was ended up cut in half. And IARPA, the intelligence agency running it, just dedicated the last 2 years purely to just funding Good Judgment Project to work out why they were so good, because it was even worth comparing. So they outperform all of the models at the time, any statistical analysis, etc. So the natural question is, well, what does this teach us? What does this actually, like, how does it apply? Why does it work? And I'd split into two fields. One are kind of thinking about the questions which human judgment is most suitable and helpful for, and then what actually drives this accuracy benefit. So the kind of questions you could be thinking about if you're thinking about, okay, well, should we get forecasters to help us think about these problems and kind of predict them? Complex, kind of one time or very infrequent, less reversible, areas we have limited data, or with knowledge that's distributed across a large team. So, if you're thinking about trying to predict time series data or the weather, probably professional forecasting isn't worth it. The data there's heavy amounts of data. You can do lots of interesting and good, robust statistical analysis. It's kind of repeatable. You often have rain, etc. You can see the various weather charts and kind of make informed predictions from that. But problems you have, a lot of these geopolitical, regulatory ones ultimately which involve a lot of human decision making, external human decision making. If it relies on politicians, if it relies on other businesses, if it relies on interactions between countries, these are areas which are incredibly complex. They often aren't rerun, and you can't just test it over time. So this is where human judgment comes in, because we're able, minds still have the ability to deal with these kind of complex, multifaceted issues, and do it relatively accurately. Select people who are trained, especially if they use the second column, which ultimately is kind of a simplified but ultimately kind of cheat sheet of how you can try and drive this. The two at the start and the two at the end are ultimately things like governance things you can set up, or structures you can set up in your own team. And the third one is much more about like a process by which you're coming to your judgments. So one is purely just keeping score. And this is mainly about accuracy, incentivizing. So you want to drive incentives. Our forecasters are paid and are hired based purely on accuracy. If they're not accurate forecasters, they don't get to be professional forecasters. They don't get to work as a forecaster. No one cares if they're, it doesn't matter what they say is going to happen, because it's purely, are they telling you are they giving you good, accurate advice? And that's very good incentives. You don't often have that in a business, because there's understandably lots of other things you want to consider. So after you do that, after you start keeping score, you can start identifying who the best forecasters are, who naturally has an ability, pattern recognition, etc. And it doesn't always map on well to other kind of skills people will have, creativity skills, etc. Being able to even come up with good decisions and implement them, etc. That's not necessarily what makes the best forecaster. What makes best forecaster is often the third one, which is structured reasoning and structure for forecasting. So how are you going about actually making a forecast, looking at certain things, and there's checklists and stuff that we often use during our workshops, but things like identifying what's your base rate, how often does said event occur, and therefore basing that off how are you updating, how you make sure you're not over updating. And often forecasters you'll find is they're very good at taking new information in and not over or under updating on it. So I know we have one of our forecasters who has told me a story about when he was working with a client and they said they disagreed with him, their internal team, and he looked at all their reasoning for it, and he said, so I updated slightly on it, but not by much, because I didn't think X, Y, and Z. I thought they were missing this point and this point. And that's fairly unusual. Most people, if they're pushed heavily by an internal team, especially if it's a client who's saying, no, I think you're totally wrong on this, they're going to update quite a lot. Whereas this guy was like, nope, this is my reasoning, and I'm going to stick to it. And I'll update slightly, but not as much as you assume. And then finally, the kind of last 2 points: you build your teams. So this only really works because you have multiple different people coming, multiple perspectives. You build the teams and you do structured collaboration. Red team one another, stress test ideas. A lot of forecasters are quite disagreeable, and therefore that creates intense discussion. But it also creates a kind of you get to the kind of crux of the problem what you're trying to deal with. And you only get that through doing a good team and doing a structured process to that to make sure it's productive. And finally, aggregate the judgment. So there's some kind of more sophisticated aggregation methods you can do, but crudely, the baseline is you go for the median outcome. So you get all their views, you aggregate all the forecasts together, and you take that aggregate judgment, and you end up then being able to see also the range that sits in. So before we jump into the last kind of little bits, I think it's important to highlight why this matters. If it's not already, if I've not mentioned it before, there's obviously hopefully examples you can start to think of. Okay, well, how will knowing what the future is going to hold with a greater degree of accuracy, or knowing how if we do X, will it lead to a better outcome or not with a greater degree of accuracy matters. But here's a real world example we did recently, which we found a number of people in the financial sector found quite interesting, which is the Indo-Pakistan conflict. So this is quite a rapid forecast. Hopefully you can see it all right on your screen. I'm pointing at the text, but I'll walk through. You obviously had the terrible terrorist attack that happened in Kashmir around the end of April. And then very quickly after, we did a rapid forecast to say, well, do we think it's going to escalate? And we did the escalation. The proxy of an escalation was how many military deaths there were going to be. And we basically said there's an incredibly low likelihood that there's going to be lots of military deaths, and therefore not a large We didn't think it was going to spiral out into a larger conflict. And we did that by the 2nd of May. If you had read any of the news between basically then until the 10th of May, it was all talking about how this was going to boil up into a big conflict. And lots of people on the ground were talking about that and saying, this is going to be the next big world conflict. It's going out. Obviously, you had very visible kind of cautious moments or scary moments where you had planes flying at one another, etc. But ultimately, our view was that this kind of stuff generally peters off. There are X, Y, and Z reasons why we thought that. And then on the 10th of May, a ceasefire was agreed, and that obviously all died down, thankfully. But obviously, if you're in that space, if you're exposed to India, Pakistan financially, or in terms of your business interests, etc., having an extra week ahead of the curve is incredibly valuable to know. Okay, wait, we need to approach this as if it's unlikely to happen versus go in. And obviously, for different clients, it works differently. Maybe the risk of 8.5% is still too high, but you need to put mitigations in place, or maybe it's not enough. So it always depends on business of how you translate this into the risk you face. But ultimately, just understanding there's a higher chance it's not going to happen than we thought. We can kind of get rid of the noise. And then I'll really quickly run through this just to give you a sense of what the forecasting process looks like. So you've identified a problem, and this is the most critical stage. Like, what is it actually you care about? What issue, risk, and opportunity do you actually care about? You're trying to get by. Take the India-Pakistan example. People might just be interested, is it going to spiral into a wider conflict just for interest? Maybe that is the question they care about, but often it's a stage deeper than that. Like, actually, it's something else they really care about. If a conflict happens, it's this thing going to happen, and how does that affect me? And then once we know that, you can generate the question. You then formulate a question into something which is forecastable, looking for something which has a clear deadline, is resolvable, and drives those incentives so everyone's in the kind of same ballpark. Then we go into the forecast, where the forecasters will undertake the deep research. They'll do the discussion. They have their own kind of modeling they do as well, often alongside. And then this is all aggregated. Sometimes this could be alongside subject matter experts. If it's like a really technical area, you can bring that in to make sure you've got all the context. And then finally, it will be reported in some fashion. In the Swift Center, we do this in a large report with kind of an interactive dashboard, but different organizations and groups do it in different ways. That's kind of a flow through forecasting. Sorry for a bit of a run through, but hopefully of use.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you very much for running us through that. I'm curious now, I guess now that the war in Ukraine is still going on, right? I wonder, I don't know if you know this, but was a prediction made before it started? And could we look back now to see where you go? Like, was the prediction right? Or is there enough data to look back now to say, okay, actually, from all the data we have before the war started, what would the forecasts have looked like as the plausibility?
Yeah, it's a great question. So from a Swift Center side, we were actually set up in March 22, so just a month after. So we didn't have a forecast for it, but there are definitely forecasting platforms which were kind of tracking that. I don't know of the exact. You have things like Metaculus, which is a large forecasting platform, which will have that data. We could kind of do backwards compatible stuff. The risk is obviously the risk of hindsight bias is huge, and you're gonna want to do that. What we often do is we do a bunch of public forecasts throughout the year. One to try and capture kind of interesting topics, but then we also look to resolve those. So India, Pakistan was obviously a very short running one. We had one on coal, which was around the idea of, will coal demand go up or down? And that's one which we were counter to everyone else in the market, including the International Energy Agency. And we were correct on those. But we try and go back and basically review of those ones. We did do one on the Wagner coup. So we did like a 24-hour live forecast where we were updating as the story was going on to give people an idea. And that was quite interesting. I think a couple of our forecasters were literally on a plane at the time trying to use their Wi-Fi to provide their insights and thoughts. And I think generally we got that one as it was going to die down. They weren't going to get to Moscow, etc. But and with all this stuff, you're not 100% accurate all the time. And that's why some of the stuff that's most important is actually the rationale we're putting behind it. Because if you get an idea of, okay, this is how uncertain they are, this is why.
It kind of reminds me of I forgot what year it was created, but the movie with Tom Cruise, The Minority Report, where you start getting this predictive way of saying, okay, this person seems to be okay now, but based on all the data they have, they can predict that they will commit a crime at this time or that time. So then they try to stop it from happening. So I hope we don't go that far, right? Because, as humans think, sometimes we have irrational thoughts. But when it comes to these conflicts or any other kind of, way to kind of have these, interpretations, I feel like it's very useful because, like you said, then, it's not always accurate, but at least then you have an idea and you could decide to spend more time researching something or divert resources to start looking into different things, or say, okay, let's take a more patient approach and let's see how it plays out. But still, nonetheless, it's information gathering, so that helps in and of itself. I think it could also kind of be a kind of a competitive advantage on when to kind of really escalate things, or to say, okay, let's take a more wait and see approach.
Exactly that. Yeah, it's trying to bring clarity to the stuff you care about and the decision you need to make. Like I said at the start, we're always trying to make predictions. Whenever you think about the work you're doing, you're taking actions because you're thinking something's going to happen in the world, or you need to prepare for the potential of it.
Right.
What this ultimately adds is a big jump. I mean, the way I sometimes talk about it is, if someone offered you 30% increase in your financial reporting, people would jump at it, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do in a more uncertain area, but for your kind of wider decisions. Like, how can we just help you get better clarity in the future so that so you can get this comparative advantage, exactly, a competitive advantage. Well, we assess that this is more likely this scenario, and therefore we're going to put more energy into preparing for it. Oh, if you're more often right than not, then you're going to have that advantage.
Yeah, and this kind of, I think, is a nice segue into the next part of your presentation. So during our conversations on, kind of how we would present this to our community, I posed the question, okay, at least what's top of mind to me and maybe other people in the sanctions field is, what does the China-Taiwan situation look like? So you're not providing a forecast per se, but you could at least provide us a walkthrough on how you go about setting up that agenda on how to really, I guess, at the end, kind of build out that forecast. So sorry if you thought we were going to build one of those. That's not going to happen today, but James is nice enough to walk us through the process on how they kind of get to that stage where they can then make that prediction.
Yes, absolutely. At least because I would need our whole team of forecasters to rely on. So
Exactly.
yeah, not today. One of the key things is like the stepping stones. And what I'll go through the process in a minute, and what I'll just highlight here is each step helps us to break this down and cut out the noise. We're able to break down the question. So one thing I'll post you in a minute is, and I'll let you think on it now, is like, what are the key things actually about the China-Taiwan conflict which is most concerning to you? Like, what would matter if it happened? And we ultimately just try and drive down, like, breaking it down into these clear problems, trying to drive good incentives and accuracy, because then we can focus on those, and also to try and drive out the noise and difference in reasoning. So this graph is often nice because when I start saying stuff like, well, it's likely or not likely, people can have different bands of where we're sitting on that. And sometimes the bands are huge. When someone says, like, we doubt, some people might think you're 70%, some people might think you're 10%. So that's when we start talking about numbers, and that's like to try and make sure we've got consistent and standardized language. I'll go through this so we get into the China one quite quickly, but ultimately try and think of like different hierarchy of events. So single events for China, it could be, will there be an invasion? Will there be a blockade? But then you also want to think about what's actually the causes and what's the consequences, and which one you care about more. Do you want to be able to predict it more in advance? So do you want to say, well, if there's like a big pro-independence party which gains either wins an election or gains political power somehow, how much does that change the likelihood of an invasion or a blockade? And that's what you're really caring about. Is like, okay, what are the causes that drive it? Alternatively, on the consequential side, maybe you're just thinking, okay, well, if a blockade happens, what's the likely retaliation from Europe and US? And how's it different from if there's an invasion? Like, do we think they're basically the same thing, or will it be softer? And what's the likelihood of those? So yeah, these are kind of the what if scenarios. These kind of conditionals allow you to then weigh up these different options, and then you can tailor it even to your own. If we did this, would we be shielded from this impact? So yeah, we'll dive into China-Taiwan, and I'll run through. And the key kind of question back to me would be, thinking about that kind of central event. If we just said that there was a blockade of Taiwan by China as a central event, what are the kind of things in your mind that you'd be thinking of? Okay, now this is a risk for my community that we need to kind of be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the supply chains will be affected for many different commodities. So I think that, at least for me, is the biggest concern, right? Because it's anything from technology to construction equipment to even food to clothing. So it's for both countries too, right? So it could be, the full blockade of Taiwan, or it could even be just now China's focusing on the war. So they're pulling the factory workers out to be in the war. So I guess it could be twofold. But yeah, my biggest concern is, that's how the supply chains will be affected and how the world could sustain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely perfect. Yeah, I put you a bit on the spot there, but that's very typical to a discussion. So that's really helpful, because how we walk through this is ultimately kind of two parts. So I'll do the risk of like a blockade, let's say, and then we talk about the supply chain, which is a consequence of that. So
Right.
crudely, we'd walk through and say, most often we attack it as what's our prior position? What's our starting baseline? So you'd look at, well, how often has China and Taiwan, how often has China done a blockade of Taiwan? So that's one. It's different. When we talk about base rates, it's different kind of reference classes you could use. So we could just say, what's the likelihood that China, how often has China in the last 20, 30 years, let's say 30 years of modern China set up, how many times have they blockaded Taiwan? You could broaden that out and say, well, how many times have they blockaded any country? And you start to get to a percentage which is going to be pretty low, right? They don't often go out and blockade countries. And that's your kind of baseline. And a lot of initial accuracy and importance of forecasting is to understand, like, how consistent are your baselines and how relevant are they in this context? So you might say, okay, well, look, they haven't blockaded Taiwan in the last 30 years, but now is an incredibly different time. That is true, but you want to make sure that you're not overweighting current context too much. A great example is often with political parties, and people, a typical pub discussion might be, oh, do you think the current government's going to collapse? And it's very easy to say, well, I think so because X, Y, and Z, it's a struggle for them now for these reasons. But if you actually look across history, typically governments don't collapse. Depending on where you class that reference class, you may say, well, look, over the last 50 years, most governments survive, so I should anchor towards that. You might say in the last 10 years, most governments seem to collapse, so maybe I should anchor towards that. And that's a big part of how you're reasoning and different judgments and different arguments people would make on which one's most reliable. Take the China and Taiwan and focus on that. There's not been a blockade before, so it's an unusual event. If it happens, it's not a typical unusual event. So we should have a starting probability which is relatively low. And then we layer on top this kind of current context. So you have situations such as, okay, there seems to be a kind of impetus in China, right? They've said they want to have a military situation where they could take Taiwan by 2027. And that's quite a bold statement. You've got the US becoming potentially more isolationist. So does this now make a good opportunity for China? Does that increase the likelihood of it? You have to look at probably the Russian context as well and think Russia have done Ukraine, but it's been quite heavy hit to them economically. It's also not been a very successful military campaign for them. And therefore China taken lessons from that and said, well, look, how much political, economic, and military capital do we want to actually spend on Taiwan? And then if you focus on these kind of supply chain elements, you have to think to yourself, well, obviously you've got, I forget the acronym, but the superconductor TCMP or TCMB, one of the ones your listeners will know, the superconductors are obviously a big part of the AI supply chain. As AI continues to increase, maybe China keeps falling behind the US, it becomes more attractive, they take the assessment. So these are the kind of things we're weighing up, and this is why you need multiple people, because they come with different perspectives and different ideas, and you kind of weigh those against one another and you aggregate them, etc. But that's the ultimate process we're kind of thinking about, and you kind of discussing those elements. What I would say is you kind of look against the baseline you had, and you say, right, well, based crudely on those kind of points, you would probably conclude it's more likely than the baseline. How much more likely would you think? Doubly as likely as any previous year that it's going to fall in the next 12 months. And then obviously as you expand the timeline, you expand the chances of this happening. So maybe you say, well, okay, let's say baseline of them doing a blockade of Taiwan would be 4%. well, within the next 12 months, doesn't quite feel like, it's an increase, but not by much. So let's say it's like 6%. And then you go, but by 2027, that's the time they've got a real kind of interest in it. The US are going to have a clear example. I think the US is going to become more isolationist. They're going to be more tired of the war in Ukraine if it's continuing. This is kind of a culminating moment, and therefore I'm bumping it up. It's going to be, I'm thinking it's 3 times more as likely. So it's almost 15% now. And we can start tracking is, okay, over time, how much does that increase? That's boiling down. Obviously, then we want to do some deeper analysis on exactly like some of those components I've talked about, what we think the influencing elements would be. So then we have the core event, and then we go into the conditional. Okay, if they blockaded it, what's the likelihood that a major sector, say technology exports, are going to be disrupted? Again, you kind of do the same process. Well, how likely in a blockade scenario are they going to blockade goods on the technology? Well, quite high. Normally when you blockade something, it's because you don't want it getting out. So, we should expect that to be quite likely. Equally, it's a big part of Taiwan's economy. China may want to profit off of it. Maybe they do that. Maybe they'll utilize it as like actually a blockade for them will just be they put military boats all around and then charge any boats exporting and going through any of the large shipping containers, they just charge. It also could be a case of, okay, well, how do you think the world's going to react to aggressive movements from China? Do we have sufficient stockpiles elsewhere that actually Taiwan becomes less important by the time we reach 2027 in terms of the supply chain because they try and diversify or they create stockpiles in other countries, etc. And therefore, though the impact on Taiwan may be still significant, the actual global impact on the supply chain is less effective because companies have been reacting to this ahead of time. And then so you kind of play on that like likelihood of, you also want to separate out what's the baseline of just there being a supply chain disruption without an invasion at all. So you can have your baseline scenario and say, well, sometimes supply chains just get affected. Maybe Taiwan gets hit by, unfortunately, it's like an earthquake. Rabbit holes you can go down. So you want to like kind of constrain these risks, but you start thinking about, okay, where's the baseline of risk that they have? And if China invades, do we think it's going to increase it? And do we think it's increased it by much? And how much is that? And then you kind of overlay that on top. So then you start getting into this realm of, well, yes, if China, crudely, they've got a crude assessment, I'll give on this is, the likelihood you expect China to invade Taiwan would probably be increased from the baseline. So it feels like a higher risk now than it's been in the most recent period. And if they did disruption on supply chains, critical supply chains like tech, etc., you would have then a higher confidence that yes, they're going to be severely disrupted from Taiwan. And one of the reasons I ask about like, what you care about is because the critical element is maybe the pure thing you're just worried about is will there be sufficient, I'm not suggesting this is necessarily what you guys would care about, but potentially, are there sufficient superconductor chips to keep prices from massively inflating on technology? And that's a very particular question because, as I say, then we want to factor in, well, how quickly do we think the supply chain is going to get disrupted? Is a lot of the supply chain actually even via shipping? A lot of the superconductors, etc., can be flown. So unless they're blockading the sky, which is significantly more challenging unless they do a ground invasion, then it'll be absolutely fine. Maybe it'll be like hardly any impact because they'll just fly all the chips out, and that's therefore not so risky as opposed to something which can't be like construction materials. So this is why like kind of grappling with that problem that you care about and making sure the question is really focusing on that can then give you an idea of, if you're thinking, okay, you're a company which is dealing with Taiwan and you're thinking ahead of time, you're a tech company and you're thinking we need superconductors. Maybe if we work through a forecast like this, you'd go, oh, okay, I need to diversify, or I need to make sure that we're flying this stuff out. Or actually, you see the likelihood between an invasion and blockade, we may predict is basically the same, and therefore flying out isn't going to work because there's going to be a war zone, and therefore the best option you have is diversify your supply chain or make sure you've got stockpiles elsewhere.
Yeah, super interesting. And at least for me, the key point is focusing on the question that you really want to hone in on, because my brain is like, what about this? What about that? What about this? But yeah, it's then tough to really zero in on something when you're looking all around. So it's, trying to be very specific on what you're looking at and then drilling down deeper from there. So yeah, that to me is a really key part that I feel like I didn't realize before, but makes total sense.
Yeah, and a lot of this is is it's not common sense, but it is, it's logical. That's ultimately what we're trying to do, is trying to break down these problems into like the most logical form. And then layer on top of that of like, well, how am I shifting? And obviously I did this in 5 minutes, and through our discussions, etc. Yeah, it's slightly more bringing in various data sources, etc., information on shipping and exports, etc. Yeah, you're ultimately breaking this down to like a logical problem and trying to hone it into like, well, keep focused on this and how does it matter? And you want a balance between an open environment where people can throw ideas in, because that's where you get the most unusual ones. And we've had many times people say, well, what about this context? Like, oh, of course, that's really important not to miss, but also making sure that everything is guided towards, well, what is it we actually think will influence this question? And therefore we should be waiting.
And I'm just curious, when you're working with, the teams at Swift Center, or if you're working with a client, is a lot of what you're doing is kind of trying to coach them to kind of get into these spaces where, you're trying to find the right focus, so then it allows you to do your job a lot better, or maybe it's a mix of, then you're also talking to the teams and helping facilitate those conversations to be like, okay, have we thought about all the possibilities for this specific question or not? Because like you said, sometimes somebody might raise their hand and be like, did you think about this? And then that gets thrown in the mix. So yeah, in that context, I guess I'm just curious, how does it look like from both when you're working with the client and both when you're working internally on these tasks?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of two parts of how we often operate. One is we may go into organizations and do basically training and collaborative forecasting with them. So that may just involve us coming in and like trying to facilitate this process for them and try to help them come to the judgments. We may sometimes have our own forecasters who take part in that as well, versus where we do all the forecasting. Again, the crucial tie-in is always this question focus. So we kind of do both of those angles, and how it differs, it's basically the same question and identification process. We really just want to know, like, what is it you care about? Why do you care about that? And digging into that. Sometimes people can feel it's a little bit like invasive, but really what we're just trying to do is we're trying to make sure you get your best value add, because if we can give you the thing that actually ties to the decision you care about, that's where all our value add is for you. A lot of that kind of focus in workshops or in our own consultancy, we'll do a lot of front loading of like, okay, why do you care about this? What do you care about? Why? When it comes to the actual forecasting, that's where it probably most differs, because obviously our professional forecasters, this is their bread and butter, this is what they do. They have a massive wealth of experience, and it's actually mostly just about like guiding that conversation to make sure they're constantly thinking about what the client wants and what the kind of question is. So if we do the first part well, the forecasting stuff is generally very smooth, because the forecasters are just, they do a massive amount of research, massive amount of like analysis and stuff, because they love it. It's what they do. It's what they're paid to do. Whereas if it's working within a team internally, there's a lot more we have to do for supporting that process to make sure that people are, because you're also trying to train people in a kind of more structured reasoning, and that can be quite alien. And it also goes against sometimes their own internal incentives, right? If your boss, your boss really thinks this one idea is like the best thing to do, then it's difficult for you in a meeting to say, well, actually, I don't think that's going to help us at all. Whereas our forecasters don't care. They'll just tell you that's no good. Please do this one, or don't please do it. This is just more likely to succeed. So there's more we have to do, and kind of trying to structure and facilitate that. Fundamentally, yeah, it's very similar in the process. The accuracy is often better, obviously, with professionals, but the internal capability you get from the former is sometimes really, really valuable.
And I'm curious. I mean, I could see where we're running out of time, but I guess the last question I have is, let's say a client comes to you and they're asking you something very similar to what you've worked on before. Do you have like a database of all the work you've done, so then you could kind of check through that first and then maybe use that for the next kind of, potential forecasting project? Or do you always start from scratch based on that specific conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of a couple of dimensions to it. One is we have an application, a purpose-built application, which actually only recently we released for people to use externally as well, but it's been purpose-built just for us. So we have all of our forecasts that we do, which is in this secure application of ours, and therefore we can go back on previous questions. It allows us also to track our accuracy and say like, oh look, we got this one wrong or right, and this is why, and kind of delve into that. That does enable us to look at previous forecasts we've done. There's obviously one component, which is any data which is obviously ours, our own internal research and analysis. That's fine to use across. Anything that's obviously from a client and proprietary information, we don't use and don't share across, which hopefully goes without saying, but that kind of limits in some contexts. The other one is how close the questions actually are. So it may be a case where it's in the same region, it may be about the same kind of issue in the Middle East or issue in China and Taiwan, but fundamentally the question is very different, so you have to start from scratch. Typically, no, if it's in the same area, we'll want to review, like, well, what did we say before? Why? How is this different? Why is we coming to different conclusions? How are we updating, etc.? And that's, yeah, we use it as a bank of knowledge from ourselves. So yeah, and you want to keep updating. You want, what we're looking at exploring now is actually something around a subscription where we do frequent quarterly updates. For anyone wants to get access to those, where we will show, like, this is kind of set of forecasting questions, and we'll update over time, so you can see, okay, well, this is how we're building upon what we said before.
Interesting. And something just popped into my head while you were explaining that, is you had mentioned that you kind of also use the data you have for previous projects and to go back to see, okay, how accurate you were, did we miss anything? And to me, that sounds a bit scary because, there's a term in the United States called the Monday morning quarterback. So because American football is generally played on a Sunday, right? So then Monday morning, way after you saw the games, you could then complain about they messed up because they should have done this and done that. But the game's already over. You already saw the game. So it's easy for you now after the fact to say, well, the team messed up because of that play. They should have done something different, or, oh, that guy dropped the ball, he should have caught it. So I feel like sometimes that's like part of what we do, but also kind of what you do is at that time with the information you have, and at that moment, you're making certain judgment calls and predictions that obviously might change if you look at it again a day, a month, a year from that time. So how do you balance those kind of judgment calls?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and you see this all the time. And a big thing I like, I never actually heard about the Monday morning quarterback. That's great. I might steal that as an example. Because yeah, it's very typical outcome bias, right? It's the same thing if you're given a 50-50 coin flip, and you say, well, if it gets heads, I'll give you £100, and if it gets tails, you give me £10. Logically, you should always make that bet because you should win. But then if they flip it and you're wrong, you've got to pay them, the outcome bias will be like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And so the way you can counter that is transparent reasoning. And that's what we're big on. We're big on the rationales, big on why did you come to this conclusion? So we can look and say, well, look, we said this is the kind of base rate. This is what you're updating on. This is the information you used. How reasonable is that now looking back as a good information source? And rather than like a punishing exercise, we're trying to say, well, how silly you were for thinking that. It's like, okay, now we know when we're going forward, we've got a bit of a blind spot there, or X, Y, and Z. You just need to we need to make sure we're double checking that the base rates in this situation are reliable. So it's more about learning, and the sheer amount of kind of transparency and reasoning, structured reasoning as you can provide. That's when we can go back and do it in a constructive and productive way, where it's not just saying, oh, of course we should have thought that. It's like, well, based on the information we had, sometimes you still made the best judgment. But if you say something's going to happen 20% of the time, you should expect it to still happen 2 out of 10 times. So, maybe this was just unfortunately one of the 2 out of 10 times where, it happened, and that's it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That you talk about kind of governance and transparency around your rationale and stuff, because I mean, that's what I feel like it's a big kind of preaching point and training point for us, right? When we're making judgment calls in a transaction or a customer, it's all about having the right rationale where it's clear why you're making the certain decision, providing any evidence that swayed you in any way. Because and sometimes it's not good. We try to say don't use URLs because they could go dead at a certain time. So try to use screenshots or other things because that will live forever. But as long as you have a clear rationale, then obviously it could be a mistake and a misjudgment, but at least somebody else who's looking at it understands why you've made that decision. And like you said, it's not about punishing anybody. It's just all about training and upskilling and learning from those kind of missteps. So I like that point.
Yeah, and it all comes back to that calibration curve, right? What you want is, if you're a decision maker, is to go, when this person's telling me it's 30% likely, is that information which I can use to weigh up my risk. Maybe you fall and go, well, actually 30% is too risky. We need to mitigate it. Or maybe you say it's not. The thing is, if you just think that 30% is like finger in the air, no idea, then it's meaningless. Whereas if we can say, well, when our team says 30%, we are right 30% of the time. Sorry, we're right 30% of the time. It occurs as we say. Or no, that's not actually quite right. As in terms of when we say that it's going to happen 30% of the time, that's an accurate judgment. You can actually make a bet on that, and you can say, okay, it's a reasonable thing to now follow through and use that as a benchmark for my decision. So that's ultimately why. And as I say, you can drill down and why, and you want to continue to improve. Yeah, you want to know when you're being told something, you can trust that information is going to be as close to accurate as possible.
Awesome. So on that note, James, before we say goodbye, are there any key takeaways that you would like to share with our audience, with our community, based on kind of our conversations and what you walked through today? Yeah, any pearls of wisdom you have for us?
I'll tell you about pearls of wisdom. I mean, I guess I just kind of get people to consider how much of your day-to-day decisions are impacted by predictions you're trying to make. And therefore, if it's complex enough of an issue, whether the techniques we talked about today, the services, even what we can provide, etc., will be useful to help you get a bit of clarity. If knowing something by 10, 20% or more would greatly change how you're going to react, then it's a great example of when forecasting can seriously help you as cut through that noise and hopefully get to a more accurate and better decision. And save time as well. It's kind of a critical part. You're not doing multiple things or chasing your tail. You can make more confident decisions. So just keep it on your radar is basically my main thing. It's not guesswork. It's kind of, as you said earlier, it's kind of simple sometimes when you get down to it. But it can be incredibly powerful.
Awesome. So I want to thank you again, James, for your time, walking us through that, educating us. Super, super great. So thank you again. If anyone wants to reach out to us, have any questions for us, I want to challenge anything that was said today, please reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can find us quite easily there. We're both very active on there, so please reach out. If you're curious about learning more about what Swift Center could do for you, of course, reach out to James and he'll guide you. If you reach out to me, I'll forward your message, appropriately. So don't worry. If you can't reach James, you can reach out to me, but you shouldn't have any problems reaching out to him. And yes, so on that note, again, NFCP, we're here to service you, the community. If you have any questions, concerns, suggestions, please reach out to us, via our website, nfcp.info or LinkedIn. We're always looking for, good ideas to make sure that we're providing what you need when you need it. And we'll call it a day, but hopefully we get a lot of feedback from this video, and then maybe, James, we could work on maybe a live webinar. We'll see. So again, to the audience, please reach out to us. Please let us know, and then we could definitely work with James again in the future. So on that note, I want to say thanks again to all the viewers. Thank you again to James and the Swift Center, and be well, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.